Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into some foundational stuff. Mental health, mental illness. Our goal here is to, move past simple yes/no definitions. We want to explore the dynamics of well-being, the real cost of illness, and how crucial culture is in all this. We've got some great sources that guide us through these pretty complex ideas like the mental health continuum, the diathesis stress model. We're aiming to pull out the key insights for you.
And that's the main thing, really. This idea that mental health isn't static, it's fluid, it shifts. The World Health Organization definition actually captures this quite well. It talks about a state of well-being, realizing abilities, coping with normal life stresses, working productively, contributing. It's active.
Yeah, I like that definition. It focuses on the positive, right? What you can do, not just the absence of illness. It suggests we're talking about a scale, not just sick or well.
Exactly. And that scale is visualized really well by the mental health continuum model. Think of it like a line from optimal well-being at one end all the way to severe mental illness at the other. What's key is that people move along this line, maybe day to day, week to week. It depends on stressors, supports, what's going on inside.
Okay, so what are the sort of key points along that line? Our sources map out some specific states, don't they?
They do. They generally break it down into four areas. At the top, you've got flourishing. That's optimal well-being. You're resilient, functioning well. Then there's languishing. This is more like mild distress, feeling a bit flat, maybe struggling with motivation, but not quite meeting criteria for a disorder. Coping is reduced. Below that, moderate concern. Here, symptoms are definitely present. They're starting to interfere maybe with daily life, work, relationships, and finally, mental illness. This means clinically significant symptoms causing real distress and, importantly, impairing function in major areas of life.
Now, this is where it gets, well, interesting. The sources talk about a four-quadrant model, which kind of blows up this simple line idea, doesn't it? It shows you can actually have optimal mental health even with a diagnosed illness.
Yes, that's such a critical point. Or the flip side, you could have really poor mental health, feel awful, struggle to function, but not actually meet the criteria for any specific diagnosis in the book. Think of it like two separate axes, right? One for symptoms or diagnosis, the other for your actual level of well-being or functioning. Someone might have, say, bipolar disorder, that's a diagnosis, puts them in the illness quadrant on one axis, but maybe with effective treatment, medication, therapy, strong support, they're absolutely thriving, they're flourishing in their job, their family life. So on the other axis, they're way up high. Their overall health isn't just the diagnosis, it's how we're doing.
So the focus in treatment should always be on improving that functioning, boosting well-being, even if the underlying condition might be chronic.
Precisely. And understanding that fluidity, that complexity, it really underscores why the societal impact is so massive. The data out of Canada is, frankly, pretty startling. Mental illness isn't just personal. It's a major cause of disability across the country.
And the economic numbers?
Wow.
They're huge. What was it, $51 billion a year? When you factor in healthcare, lost work, quality of life reductions.
51 billion. It's enormous. But, beyond the dollars, there's this devastating human cost. People living with severe mental illness or addictions, they're significantly more likely to die much earlier. We're talking 10, even 20 years earlier than the general population.
It's crucial to understand why.
Yeah.
It's usually not suicide, right? It's physical conditions that are often preventable.
Overwhelmingly, yes. Cardiovascular disease, diabetes, respiratory problems, things that could be managed or prevented. It just proves how deeply connected mental and physical health really are. It's all one system.
Which probably explains another data point you mentioned. The cost of disability leave for mental illness being about double that for physical illness.
It does. It suggests the path back, the recovery process from mental health impairment is often longer, maybe more complex. It needs more resources, more time than recovering from, say, a broken leg.
Okay, so let's dig into the why behind this fluidity. If mental health can shift so much and the costs are so high, what's the model that explains why some people are pushed towards illness by stress while others seem to manage better?
Right, that leads us straight to probably the most accepted framework for this, the diathesis stress model. It's all about understanding risk. Basically, it proposes that mental illness arises from an interaction between two things. First, the diathesis. That's your underlying vulnerability. It could be genetic, family history. It could be biological, like brain chemistry, or psychological, maybe early trauma, learned coping styles. And second, you have the stress. These are the life events, the environmental triggers. Illness happens when the amount of stress overwhelms the person's ability to cope, given their underlying diathesis. It tips the balance.
So it's like a predisposition meeting a trigger. Okay, If stress is that trigger, how does our body actually handle it physically? Let's talk about Hans Selye's model, the General Adaptation Syndrome, or GAS.
Ah, yes, GAS. It's a great way to understand the body's physical timeline when facing ongoing stress. It starts with stage one, alarm. This is your classic fight or flight. Sympathetic nervous system kicks in, heart rate jumps, you get that rush of adrenaline, cortisol, mobilizing energy.
Makes sense for, like, seeing a bear. But what about chronic stress? Deadlines, money worries, stuff that doesn't just go away.
Exactly. That pushes you into stage two. Resistance. The body tries to adapt to cope with the ongoing stressor. It tries to maintain alertness, keep functioning, but it's doing this by burning through reserves, keeping hormone levels higher than normal. You might feel like you're managing, but you're running on borrowed time, physiologically speaking.
And that sustained effort, that's costly, which links back to those longer disability leaves we talked about.
Absolutely, because if the stress doesn't let up and those reserves keep getting drained, you eventually hit stage three, exhaustion. The tank is empty, the body's coping mechanisms start to fail. And that leads to physical fatigue, your immune system weakens, you get brain fog, and eventually, potentially, breakdown. Both mental and physical illness become much more likely.
The sources also detailed some specific neurochemical effects of chronic stress. It's not just a feeling, it's doing actual damage, isn't it?
It really is. That constant activation of the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system, means chronic high cortisol. And while cortisol is vital short-term, long-term exposure messes with mood regulation, sleep, thinking. It's strongly linked to anxiety and depression. And what's really interesting is how chronic stress seems to affect serotonin receptors too. It might make the brain less efficient at using the serotonin it does have. So even if production isn't the issue, the signaling is impaired.
And connecting that back to the physical toll, those premature deaths, we need to bring in psychoneuroimmunology.
Yes, definitely. PNI shows this feedback loop clearly. Chronic stress doesn't just feel bad, it actively suppresses your immune system. You see drops in important immune cells like lymphocytes, natural killer cells. This makes the body more vulnerable to infections, it promotes chronic inflammation, slows healing, and that directly contributes to those physical illnesses, cardiovascular issues, diabetes, respiratory problems. The mental stress literally drives physical disease.
Okay, so we have these powerful mechanisms, diathesis stress, GAS pushing towards exhaustion. But there's a counterforce, right? Resilience.
Resilience is absolutely key. It's that ability to adapt well, to bounce back when things get tough, adversity, trauma, major stress. It's the buffer. It determines if a stressor knocks you down a level on the continuum or if you can hold your ground.
How do professionals actually look for resilience? For someone listening, what are the practical parts of being resilient?
Well, when assessing coping, we look at a few things. Are there consistent health-sustaining habits? Good sleep, decent nutrition, some exercise, often the first things to slide under pressure. We also look at life satisfaction. Is there a sense of purpose? And crucially, social supports. Are there strong connections? And then, how does the person actually respond to stress? Are they using effective strategies like problem solving, asking for help, trying to reframe things positively? Or are they leaning towards avoidance, substance use, denial? Building these protective factors is how you raise your stress threshold.
The sources had a good list of practical stress management techniques. Let's touch on those. Cognitively changing how you think about stress.
Right. That's where things like cognitive reframing come in. Actively challenging those negative automatic thoughts, replacing them with more balanced ones. Also, mindfulness practices, using positive self-talk, even finding humor in situations can help create distance.
And behaviorally, what actions can people take to sort of reset their nervous system?
Behaviorally, it's about tangible actions. Relaxation techniques are big, deep breathing exercises, progressive muscle relaxation things that activate the rest and digest system. Physical exercise is huge for burning off stress hormones, and practical stuff like better time management, setting realistic goals to reduce that feeling of being overwhelmed.
Okay, before we get into the huge topic of culture, let's quickly mention the formal tools professionals use to make sense of all this complexity, the DSM-5 and the mental status exam.
Sure. The DSM-5 Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders is basically the standard classification system. It gives agreed-upon criteria for different diagnoses. So when clinicians talk about major depressive disorder, they mean the same checklist of symptoms. It's vital for consistency in diagnosis, treatment planning, research. And the mental status examination, or MSE, is the structured way clinicians assess someone's current psychological state. It's often remembered by the acronym ABCT.
Right, ABCT. Appearance, behavior, cognition, thought, content, process. But maybe tell us why looking at these things is so informative. What does, say, appearance tell a clinician?
It's about observing clues to internal states. So, under appearance, noticing poor self-care, maybe disheveled clothing, that could signal withdrawal, depression, a lack of energy or motivation. In behavior, observing things like unusual posturing, pacing, agitation that might point towards psychosis, severe anxiety, or mania. Cognition looks at orientation, memory, attention, but also crucial things like insight. Does the person recognize they might have an illness, or do they attribute their experiences to something else? And then thought content examines what the person is thinking. Are there delusions, like believing people are plotting against them? And thought process looks at how they're thinking. Are thoughts logical and connected, or are they jumping all over flight of ideas, or wandering off track, tangentiality? It helps assess the basic structure of their thinking.
That assessment of structure is vital, especially when we bring in the next layer,
Yeah.
culture. Because this is where things get really nuanced. Mental health, illness, they're defined differently across cultures, aren't they?
Absolutely. Culture impacts everything. How people perceive symptoms, what's considered normal distress versus illness. It shapes help seeking. Who do you turn to, if anyone? It influences stigma. And importantly, it affects how symptoms are actually expressed. For instance, in many non-Western cultures, emotional distress might show up primarily as physical symptoms, headaches, fatigue, stomach issues. We call this somatization. A clinician without cultural awareness might miss the underlying depression or anxiety because the person isn't talking about sadness in the way the clinician expects. They might just focus on the physical complaints.
And the sources highlighted some really different worldviews. The Western tradition often emphasizes individuality, separates mind and body, looks for a specific cause to treat.
Right. Contrast that with, say, an Eastern tradition, where identity might be more rooted in the family and mind, body, spirit are seen as interconnected, needing balance. Or the indigenous tradition, emphasizing harmony with nature, community, identity, and health as a balance of emotional, mental, spiritual, and physical aspects like the medicine wheel concept.
When these different views collide in a healthcare setting, there's a real risk of misunderstanding, even harm. Barriers pop up.
Definitely. A major barrier is ethnocentrism, just assuming your own culture's way of seeing things, your diagnostic tools are the only right way or the best way. That can lead to misdiagnosis and poor care. And we have to acknowledge the specific risks for Indigenous peoples in Canada, as the sources point out. Mental health challenges are deeply tied to colonization, the trauma from residential schools, the 60 scoop, ongoing racism. It makes culturally safe care absolutely essential. That's why the Truth and Reconciliation Commission called for specific training for health professionals, like in Call to Action, #233.
The sources also mentioned the high risk for refugees, who often carry trauma from their past experiences and face huge resettlement stresses. They need trauma-informed care too.
Yes, that's another population needing very specific, culturally sensitive approaches. All these factors, biology, environment, culture, history, feed into where someone is on that mental health continuum, which means treatment needs to be flexible. The guiding principle is always the least restrictive approach possible while keeping safety paramount. That's why there's a whole spectrum of care options.
Right, from the most intensive, like 24-hour crisis support or inpatient units.
Down through intensive outpatient programs, maybe transitional living situations, all the way to ongoing support from community mental health centers or private therapists. It's about matching the level of care to the person's current need on that continuum.
Well, this has been a really comprehensive look at the sort of architecture of mental well-being. We've gone from definitions to mechanisms, models. I think the key thing for you, the listener, is remembering that mental health is dynamic. It's shaped by biology, yes, but also by stress, by history, by culture. Understanding these models, the continuum, diathesis stress gives us a better language for it all.
Absolutely. And, if we connect this back to the sources, particularly those focused on professional standards, it raises an interesting final thought. There's this professional requirement for nurses, for example, to maintain their fitness to practice. That means if they know they lack the physical, mental, or emotional capacity to do their job safely, they have an ethical duty to step back, withdraw from care until they regain that fitness. So thinking about that standard, this requirement for objective self-assessment and taking action before things get critical, what does that imply for all of us personally? Does it suggest we all have a kind of duty to monitor where we are on that continuum, to be aware of our own capacity long before we hit that exhaustion stage? Maybe that self-awareness isn't just nice to have, it's actually fundamental for staying functional?